Welcome to the Economy Magazine. I am Benjamin Chong Alfares with the top economic reports. Coming up, the effect of Western sanctions on Russia and the threat to the algae industry in Morocco. First, the headlines. The OECD cut growth forecasts for most major advanced economies, blaming Europe's sluggish recovery for weighing on global growth. The Club of Rich Nations chopped its 2014 forecast for the Eurozone economy by a third to 0.8% from an earlier forecast of 1.2%. Though it said the moderate U.S. economic expansion remains broadly on track, it cut its forecast by a fifth to 2.1% from 2.6%. The Paris-based research body did not provide an update to its forecast for global growth this year, which it forecast at 3.4% in May. The Russian ruble fell to a historic low against the dollar after the West imposed fresh sanctions over Ukraine. The ruble crossed beyond the rate of 38 to the dollar for the first time shortly after Moscow markets opened on Monday and continued its descent on Tuesday. The euro also rose against the ruble, rising past the 50-ruble threshold, close to an all-time high reached in March. Washington and the European Union on Friday imposed tough new sanctions targeting banks and major energy and defense firms. We have more on Russia following the headlines. Telecom giant Orange made a $4.3 billion offer to buy 100% of Spanish broadband and cell phone operator Jazztel. Including stock options given to some Jazztel managers, the offer is 34% higher than Jazztel's market price over the past month. If successful, the bid would allow Orange to almost double its market share in broadband internet accesses in Spain to become the country's second largest provider. Spain is Orange's second largest market, accounting for around 10% of the group's revenue. Microsoft is buying the Swedish group behind the hugely popular video game Minecraft for $2.5 billion. The deal for Swedish-based Mojang gives Microsoft one of the best-known video games of all time, bolstering the increasingly important gaming division of the U.S. tech giant. Since its launch in 2009, Minecraft has sold more than 50 million copies for PCs, smartphones, and video game consoles like Microsoft's Xbox. The deal would also help the U.S. tech giant lure more people to its struggling Windows smartphone system while drawing in a younger crop of users. Though the US and the EU expanded sanctions on Russia over Ukraine last week, their influence is still aimed at power centers. But as Moscow is forced to look for ways to circumvent the trade impediments, the result of their decisions are increasingly felt by rank-and-file Russians.
New sanctions against Russia came into effect late last week, which caused an angry response from Russian authorities. The sanctions have been put in place even though Ukraine and Russia have a delicate ceasefire. The latest measures take aim at the financial sector along with energy and defense companies, AFP reports. Some suggest the sanctions are aimed at power centers as opposed to the average Russian.
The current sanctions have relatively little effect on the rank-and-file Russians. They affect state enterprises, state companies, they affect banks, they affect now a broad number of individuals, but less so, much less so, rank-and-file Russians.
Indeed, there are mixed reactions on the Russian street to the ongoing economic hostilities between the West and Russia.
Take prices for bread, for potatoes. Prices in stores are quite different than they used to be. Prices are rising. We don't like it.
I think sanctions will help us to grow. South of the country is the granary of Russia. Sanctions? Which sanctions?
In fact, the Russian currency dropped to a historic low as the sanctions took effect. Even if violence has lulled, economics seem to be an ongoing battlefield. Meanwhile, sorely needed aid via the UN's World Food Program is arriving to the war-hit eastern region. The UN said they are aiming to feed up to 120,000 people in the next half year, which is well beyond their scope thus far. The cost will be about $15 million.
I think this aid is good. The government doesn't give money for maternity leave, and the father doesn't get a salary. We all work in the Yubileyna mine.
It is clear that the ongoing tensions between Russia and the West over Ukraine are continuing to shape daily realities for the people on the ground.
Joining us now is RT Middle East Bureau Chief Paula Slyer. Ms. Slyer, thanks very much for joining us. You just came back from Ukraine, from Donetsk. What is the atmosphere there like?
Look, there is a ceasefire that's been in place now for a short period, and it does look as if it's holding. There are flare-ups here and there, but when you talk to people there, most people don't think it's going to hold for the long run. There are people that are starting to return to Donetsk. There were thousands of refugees who left, so that's heartbreaking scenes with people coming back to their homes, and their homes are practically in ruins. There are still shortages of water and electricity. A lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed by these 5 months of fighting. But I would say the overall feeling amongst the people is that you're witnessing a lull in fighting, a temporary ceasefire, if you will, rather than something permanent. There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what's going to happen in the future, in terms of the status of eastern Ukraine and whether they'll be part of Russia, independent, or remain part of Ukraine.
Okay, well, taking this back to Russia a little bit more so, I mean, what would you say is the impact of the sanctions on the average Russian, the Russian commoner?
I would say no impact whatsoever, and certainly that's the kind of rhetoric we see coming out of the Russian government. I mean, you had the sanctions imposed last Friday by the European Union. There's another set that will be imposed this coming Friday by the United States. Russia has a lot of leverage. What Russia has done, and it continues to do, is threaten that it will have counter-sanctions. So this means, for example, that countries in Europe that rely on the Russian market are going to fall short. You have, for example, Ukraine sells a lot of meat to Russia. It no longer has the Russian market. You have other countries that sell fruits and vegetables. They no longer have that. Russia's also threatening that it's not going to allow Western air companies to use its airspace. So you do have that element happening. At the same time, you also have Russia looking for new markets. Russia signed a treaty recently with China to the tune of $400 billion for the next 30 years in terms of providing energy. So you have the West that's losing out of those kind of potential deals.
Go ahead, sorry.
So Russia certainly is, and another important point to make is that you had the ceasefire that was signed, and what Russia is saying, it's a slap in the face. Here you're witnessing a ceasefire, even though I say it's shaky, between the Ukrainians and the pro-Russian fighters, and now you're slapping sanctions on Russia. What is the message you're sending out when there are attempts being made to try and stop the fighting on the ground?
It seems like it's been sort of a delayed response by the West, I mean, where they wanted to really put in the sanctions, or they were told to put in the sanctions, and then when they finally put in the sanctions, you know, Russia's already sort of moving on, so to speak. The question is now, of course, you know, with the reestablishment of alliances, if you want, you know, new products going to the Americas, South America specifically, to China. I mean, do we see a new structure developing in terms of alliances with Russia and other countries?
Look, Russia certainly is looking more towards the east. I mean, I mentioned China, but they've also been looking to setting up something that will parallel the European Union and have different kind of customs unions themselves.
Which has been in the works for a while now.
It's been in the works, and certainly the Russian President Vladimir Putin has more ammunition now to kind of go that direction. So I do think you're looking for more kinds of alliances. But even though your question is quite economic based, I want to make a point about NATO. There's also a threat that NATO says it's not going to continue to cooperate with Russia. And the Russians are saying we live in a time when, for example, ISIS is such a huge security threat, and Russia has clout, particularly in Central Asia. Are you not going to want to use the Russian experience, particularly the ties it has with Syria and Iran, to kind of counter that? And the same kind of arguments can be made on an economic level, that Russia does have enough power, enough influence, enough markets, let's say in Central Asia, for example, that it doesn't necessarily need the Western markets. And the West is cutting itself in the foot by not allowing itself to be exposed to those markets, and also pushing Russia right out of the equation by what it's trying to do with these type of sanctions. Yeah,
well, clearly Russia is too powerful to just be ignored. Now, looking at Ukraine, the aid that is being given to Ukraine, and Ukrainians in specific, how effective has it been for the Ukraine on one hand, and the other hand for Ukrainians on the ground in Donetsk?
Look, firstly, the aid sends out a political message. It sends out a message that the Europeans and the Americans are involved in the conflict. So that's the first question mark that Russia will have over any kind of aid that's given. And that needs to be taken into context. So the Europeans will never be able to sit back and say they're completely neutral observers. Exactly what they accuse the Russians of being involved in, which is supplying aid and what like to the pro-Russian fighters. Russia's going to level the same accusations and say, what is aid? It's a very big question mark. It's not only always humanitarian aid. There was a lot of questions asked when Russia said it was sending humanitarian aid, and the West was very suspicious that could include military assistance. A lot of the aid that has been coming from the West, though, hasn't actually filtered down to the ground. It's still in the works. So, for example, it's supposed to be aid that is going to help people rebuild their homes. None of that rebuilding is taking place at the moment in eastern Ukraine. The ceasefire has only just ended. People are only just returning to their homes. So if you're asking me directly, what did I see on the ground in terms of where the billions that have been promised by the European Union are being spent? They're not being spent on anything at the moment. There is still in the cities of Lugansk and Donetsk, which are the worst hit areas and the worst hit regions, there is still a complete lack of infrastructure. There still are people without access to drinking water. There are still many, many homes without electricity. There are still fuel shortages. So the aid will need to be spent in those directions, but it's not happening right now. But in all fairness, it's because it is a complicated process and the fighting has only just stopped.
Right. It seems like the Ukrainians are suffering more than Russia is at this point. Well, Paula Slyer, Middle East Bureau Chief for RT, thank you so very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Years of uncontrolled harvesting of mineral-rich seaweed on Morocco's Atlantic coast has caused the algae known locally as red gold to become increasingly scarce. And though Morocco doesn't actually process the algae, profits from their export make it a valuable resource worth protecting.
About 20 meters underwater, these divers are looking for red gold. Algae used in the food and cosmetics industries teems off the Moroccan coast. Atabari has made finding this resource his specialty. An amateur diver, he spends his days inspecting the seabed.
Early in the year, we would harvest up to 500 kilograms of algae per day, and at the end of the year, it's no more than 200 or 300 kilograms. Algae is increasingly rare.
The red algae is used to manufacture agar, a vegetable gelatin. It sells for 30 cents a kilo, a price set by the government. But for Atabari, it's not a route to riches.
The divers do not reap the benefits of this work. It's the resellers who buy from us and export the algae who profit.
Despite being the world's largest producer, Morocco does not have a single processing plant. The vast majority of the algae is exported for production abroad.
99% of our production is for export. Unfortunately, Morocco imports products containing agar, but it is not processed here. We do not use it to make food products that contain it. It is the Japanese and the Europeans who know the benefits.
On the beach of El Jadida, families come to pick by hand the remains of algae neglected by divers, but the plant is threatened by massive overharvesting. In 2009, 14,000 tons of algae were collected. The government is now trying to limit that amount to 6,000 tons.
It was harvested very chaotically. No control, no quotas, no restrictions, no shutdown periods. Anyone during the season could work in algae. At least today, there are restrictions.
As a result of these measures, red algae is slowly returning to the Moroccan coast. And with profits from the industry at around 31 million euros, for the government, this is a resource that needs to be protected.
From the Huffington Post and the Guardian to the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, we have the reports for you in Media Watch. Daniel Roth, thanks for joining us in Media Watch.
How's it going?
Good, fantastic. So where's the first report from?
So it's coming from all over, actually. It's there's a series of reports about this new app called Bipartisan.
Bipartisan?
So normally spelled B-I partisan. This is spelled B-U-Y partisan.
We're talking, of course, about the U.S. here, I presume.
Yes. So this is an app that lets you know, you scan a barcode, and it lets you know if who's gaining, what company... who the company donates to, Republicans or Democrats. So this is From the positive side, people are saying this is a great response to something like Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that led to basically limitless donations to political candidates.
Right.
On the negative side, people are saying it's kind of the country, the U.S., is already so partisan, so torn apart that this is only going to add to it. Now, there's a lot of people saying, don't bring enterprise, don't bring economics into politics. Of course, the other side of that is it's already in the politics.
It is in the politics. I mean, economics is such a large part of the politics, especially in the U.S. I mean, how could you actually even consider it differently?
Right, but nevertheless, this is what pundits are saying. And you can look around and really get to see where your money is going when you buy an Apple product, by and large, going to Democrats.
Are people actually that politically involved in the U.S., I wonder? I mean, like, that would scan all these different products, and to what extent, what percentage would that be?
I think by and large, it's going to be a tool for activists that already exist, not something that brings people into activism.
That might already have the information handy anyways.
Right. People who are looking for that information.
Okay, well, Daniel Roth, thanks very much for giving us some more information on that. That's the end of this edition of The Economy Magazine. I'm Benjamin Chong Alfares. Thanks for joining us, and do watch us again tomorrow.